To inherit a fortune is to inherit a cage, and in the Gilded Age, the bars were made of silk and diamonds. Between 1870 and 1920, the wealthiest families in America produced a generation of daughters locked in a game they could never win. Smile too little and you were hysterical. Speak too much and you were unhinged. Refuse your husband's cruelty and you were insane. But when these women finally broke under the pressure, their families didn't call doctors. They called architects to soundproof the attic rooms where their daughters would vanish, erased from history to preserve a name printed on bank vaults and ballroom invitations. Chapter 1: The Daughters America Built to Break. Between 1870 and 1900, American fortunes grew so fast that families had no blueprint for raising girls who could survive them. The wealth arrived like a flood. Oil gushed from Pennsylvania soil. Steel mills turned Pittsburgh's sky black with profitable smoke. Railroads stitched the continent together and made millionaires of men who could barely write their names a decade earlier. By 1890, America had more millionaires than any nation in history. 4,000 families controlled wealth that would equal hundreds of billions in today's currency. And every single one of those families faced the same problem. What do you do with daughters in a world that just invented this kind of money? The sons had obvious roles. They would manage the trusts, expand the empires, sit on the boards. But daughters existed in a strange space between asset and liability. Too valuable to ignore, too female to trust with actual power. They became walking advertisements for family status, living proof that your money could buy entry into the highest tiers of American aristocracy. Their marriages would forge alliances. Their children would carry the bloodline forward. Their beauty and grace would reflect the family's cultural refinement. But they could not have opinions. They could not have ambitions. And they absolutely could not have inner lives that contradicted the image their families needed to project. Edith Rockefeller was born in 1872 into the richest family America had ever produced. Her father, John D. Rockefeller, controlled 90% of the nation's oil refining by the time she turned 10. The family fortune grew by roughly $1 million every month. Edith's childhood home in Cleveland had 40 rooms, 16 servants, and a silence so thick you could choke on it. Her father believed displays of wealth were vulgar. He raised his children in an atmosphere of disciplined austerity that made the mansion feel like a very expensive convent. Edith learned to move through rooms without making sound, to speak only when addressed, to understand that being a Rockefeller daughter meant carrying the weight of the family name without ever asking what it cost. Blanche Ulrichs arrived in 1890 into New York society with a different kind of pressure. Her family fortune came from utilities and real estate. Not Rockefeller rich, but rich enough to matter. Rich enough that Blanche's debut would be covered in 6 newspapers. Her mother dressed her like a porcelain doll and paraded her through Newport's summer season as if breeding and beauty were the only currencies that mattered. Because in that world, they were. Blanche was taught French, piano, watercolor painting, all the decorative skills required to ornament a drawing room. But when she asked for Latin lessons, her mother laughed. Dead languages were for boys who needed to become lawyers. Girls needed to become wives. Zelda Sayer was born in 1900 in Montgomery, Alabama, into a family that was prominent but not wealthy. Her father was a judge. Her mother obsessed over social standing in a city where Confederate nostalgia still determined who mattered. Zelda grew up beautiful and wild, and aware that beauty was the only capital she possessed. She danced, she flirted, she dove into swimming pools wearing an evening gown because the boys liked it. By 17, she understood the game perfectly. You performed femininity as spectacle, and if you performed it well enough, you could marry someone who would lift you into a better life. 3 girls, 3 families, 3 different entry points into the same trap. The trap worked like this. You were raised to be perfect, groomed to be displayed, taught that your value existed entirely in how others perceived you. And then, the moment you internalized those lessons and became the flawless ornament your family demanded, that perfection became evidence that you were not quite human. You were too controlled, too polished, a performance rather than a person. And if you ever cracked under the pressure and showed real emotion, real desire, real anger, that became evidence too. Evidence that you were broken, that the performance was failing, that you needed to be fixed. By the time these 3 women reached adulthood, the machinery of their erasure was already in motion. They just didn't know it yet. The only question was how long they could maintain the performance before the weight of it crushed them completely. Chapter 2: The Academy of Silk Cages. To be properly trained as an heiress required forgetting you were human and remembering you were an asset to be appraised. The education began before you could speak. Posture training at age 4. Etiquette instruction at 6. By 8, you were being molded into a shape that had nothing to do with who you actually were and everything to do with what you would eventually be sold as. Because that was the truth nobody said out loud. You were being prepared for market. The marriage market operated with all the efficiency of the stock exchange, and wealthy daughters were the commodity being traded. Finishing schools were the final polish. These institutions had names like Miss Porters and Miss Spences, and they cost more per year than most American families earned in a decade. The curriculum was designed not to educate, but to erase. You learned to walk with books balanced on your head to perfect your carriage. You practiced handwriting until your script looked identical to every other wealthy girl's. You memorized genealogies of European nobility so you could make conversation at dinner parties without revealing that you had thoughts of your own. Edith Rockefeller attended private tutorials because her father didn't believe in sending daughters away to school. But the lessons were the same. Her governess taught her how to enter a room without attracting attention, how to make herself smaller, quieter, less. When Edith showed interest in her father's business dealings, asking questions about oil refineries and railroad investments, she was redirected to needlepoint. When she asked to attend university, the idea was dismissed so quickly it barely registered as having been spoken. Education was for men who needed to think. Women needed to be pleasant. Blanche Ulrichs was sent to Brearley School in Manhattan, where wealthy girls learned to perform upper-class femininity with surgical precision. She excelled at languages. She wrote poetry in her diary that she never showed anyone. She had a mind that wanted to devour books and ideas and arguments. But the school's purpose was not intellectual development. It was social preparation. Blanche learned which fork to use for fish, how to decline an invitation without giving offense, how to laugh at a man's joke even when it wasn't funny, how to exist as decoration. The punishment for resistance was isolation. If you questioned the rules, you were removed from group activities. If you showed too much personality, you were labeled difficult and sent home with notes suggesting you needed rest. The message was clear. Conformity was sanity. Deviation was disease. By the time Zelda Sayer reached adolescence, the training was less formal, but no less brutal. Montgomery society watched her constantly. Every dance, every interaction with a boy, every choice of dress. Her mother critiqued her appearance daily. Too much rouge and you looked common. Too little and you looked ill. Smile more but not too much. Be lively but not wild. Attract male attention but never seemed to be seeking it. The contradictions were the point. You could never fully succeed, which meant you were always slightly failing, which kept you trying harder. The cruelest part was that the training worked. These women internalized the lessons so completely that they began to police themselves. Edith learned to silence her questions before they reached her lips. Blanche hid her writing because even she had started to believe that female creativity was embarrassing. Zelda performed vivacity with such commitment that she forgot which parts were performance and which parts were real. And underneath all of it, a quiet rage was building. Yeah, because you cannot spend 20 years being told you are valuable while being treated as if you have no value beyond your appearance without something inside you starting to break. The families called it preparation. The girls would eventually call it something else. They would call it the beginning of their disappearance. Chapter 3. The season they were sold. Marriage wasn't the prize at the end of girlhood. It was the transaction that proved you understood your only purpose. Edith Rockefeller married Harold Fowler McCormick in November of 1895. She was 23. He was heir to the McCormick Reaper fortune, the industrial dynasty that had mechanized American agriculture and made millions from the labor of cutting wheat. The wedding took place in the Rockefeller Mansion in New York. 800 guests and $20,000 in flowers alone. The ceremony lasted 17 minutes. Newspapers described it as the union of two of America's greatest fortunes, as if the bride and groom were merely vessels carrying money toward its inevitable consolidation. Harold was handsome in the way rich men often are, with good tailoring doing most of the work. He was polite, educated, utterly conventional. Edith barely knew him. They had been introduced at a society function, chaperoned through a series of approved meetings, and then the engagement was announced. Her father approved the match because it linked oil money to agricultural machinery, a sensible diversification. The fact that Edith felt nothing for Harold was irrelevant. Feeling was not part of the equation. The marriage contract was negotiated like a corporate merger. Edith brought a trust worth approximately $40 million in today's currency. Harold brought his family name and future control of International Harvester. The terms were clear. Edith would produce heirs. She would manage the social calendar. She would represent both families at charity events and maintain their reputations. In exchange, she would have access to wealth, status, and absolutely no autonomy over how that wealth was used. Harold controlled the money. Harold made the decisions. Edith was the Rockefeller princess who had just been purchased by the McCormick kingdom. The wedding night was a performance she had not been prepared for. Nobody told wealthy girls what happened in the bedroom. You were supposed to arrive at marriage ignorant and leave it obedient. Edith learned quickly that her body, like her fortune, was not her own. Blanche Ulrichs married Leonard Moorhead Thomas in 1910 when she was 20. He was boring. That was his primary quality. Boring and acceptable. The marriage lasted 2 years before she divorced him, which created a scandal her family barely survived. Divorce was not something respectable women did. It suggested you had failed at the only job that mattered. But Blanche's real mistake came in 1916 when she married John Barrymore. Barrymore was beautiful, theatrical, famous. He was American royalty of a different kind, born into the most celebrated acting dynasty in the country. When Blanche met him, she believed she had found someone who would understand her creative ambitions. He was an artist. Surely an artist would want a wife who was more than decorative. She was wrong. The wedding was covered in every society column. The great profile marries the heiress. Blanche wore white silk and held lilies and smiled for photographs, while something inside her screamed that this was a mistake. But she had already divorced one husband. She could not afford to be wrong again. The marriage began with passion and ended slowly in a kind of emotional suffocation that Blanche would later describe as being buried alive while everyone insisted you were dancing. Zelda Sayer married F. Scott Fitzgerald in April of 1920. She was 19, he was 23, and had just published his first novel. The book was successful enough to make him feel like success was permanent. Zelda married him because he represented escape from Montgomery, from her mother's suffocating expectations, from a life that felt too small for the electricity running through her veins. The wedding was small, quick. They honeymooned at the Biltmore Hotel in New York and proceeded to scandalize the city by drinking in the fountain and dancing on tables, and behaving like fame was a license for chaos. Zelda thought she had married someone who would let her be free. Scott thought he had married his muse, which is another way of saying he thought he had purchased unlimited inspiration he could mine for his fiction. They were both wrong. But it would take years for them to understand exactly how wrong. 3 women, 3 weddings, 3 moments where they stood in white dresses and believed, despite everything they had learned, that this might be different. That marriage might be partnership instead of imprisonment. The newspapers called them the luckiest women in America. They had wealth, beauty, husbands who were powerful or famous or both. They had everything a woman could want. What they did not have was any choice about what would happen next, and what happened next would destroy them. Chapter 4. The moment she wanted more than permission. Edith Rockefeller McCormick's crime was not that she went mad, but that she dared to think her mind belonged to her. The breaking point arrived in 1913, but the cracks had been forming for years. Edith's marriage to Harold had produced 5 children. 3 survived. Motherhood was supposed to fulfill her. Society promised that a woman with healthy children and a wealthy husband had achieved everything worth achieving. But Edith felt hollow. She described it later as living inside a beautiful room with no doors. Everything you needed was provided, everything except a reason to be alive. Harold noticed her melancholy and prescribed the standard cure for wealthy women's unhappiness: more charity work, more social events, more performance of the role she was supposed to be grateful for. It didn't work. Edith's sadness deepened into something doctors would eventually call neurasthenia, which was the medical term for when a woman's interior life became inconvenient. Then in 1913, Harold suggested they take the family to Switzerland for her health. The mountain air, the rest cure, all the standard treatments for female nervous exhaustion. But Switzerland was also where Carl Jung had recently established his practice in psychoanalysis, and Edith is desperate for anything that might explain the emptiness, asked to see him. Jung was 40 when he met Edith Rockefeller McCormick. He saw immediately what she was: brilliant, curious, intellectually starved. She had one of the finest minds he had encountered in a female patient, and it had been systematically suppressed for 4 decades. He began treating her with talk therapy, dream analysis, and something revolutionary: the belief that her thoughts mattered. For the first time in her life, someone asked Edith what she wanted. She wanted to study. She wanted to understand the human psyche. She wanted to train as an analyst herself and help other women who felt the same suffocating emptiness. Jung encouraged her. He gave her books. He taught her theory. He treated her not as a patient who needed to be fixed, but as a mind that needed to be freed. Harold was horrified. His wife was not supposed to want an education. She was not supposed to want a profession. The idea of a Rockefeller woman working, even in a field as respectable as medicine, was absurd. Worse than absurd. It was evidence that Switzerland had made her worse, not better. He demanded they return to Chicago. Edith refused. For the first time in their marriage, she said no. The fight that followed lasted months. Harold cut off her allowance. He threatened to take the children back to America without her. He consulted with doctors who assured him that Edith's obsession with psychoanalysis was itself a symptom of mental instability. Women who wanted intellectual pursuits were compensating for some deeper inadequacy. The wanting itself was pathological, but Edith had tasted something she couldn't unknow. She stayed in Switzerland. She studied with Jung for 8 years. She funded his research. She became one of the first trained psychoanalysts in the world, and she was good at it. She helped patients. She published papers. She had a purpose beyond ornament. And the whisper campaign began. Harold's family started spreading the story quietly. Edith was having a breakdown. She had abandoned her children for a charlatan in Europe. She was obsessed, manic, losing touch with reality. The McCormicks and the Rockefellers coordinated their message. Mental illness ran in families, they suggested. Look at her father's eccentricities. Look at her intensity. This was always going to happen. Switzerland didn't cause it. Switzerland just revealed what was already broken. By 1921, when Edith finally returned to Chicago, the narrative had hardened into fact. She was not a trained psychoanalyst. She was a mentally ill woman who had wasted 8 years on a delusion. The proof was simple. She had defied her husband. She had pursued knowledge without permission. She had believed her mind was her own. Those were not the actions of a sane woman. Those were the actions of someone who needed to be controlled. Harold began building the cage that would hold her for the rest of her life. He took control of her trust completely. He made decisions about her social calendar. He decided which friends she could see. He consulted with doctors who agreed that Edith needed supervision. Not hospitalization yet, just oversight, in just enough control to keep her from embarrassing the family further. Edith's children were told their mother was fragile, that she needed rest, that too much excitement would damage her. The children began to look at her differently, not as a mother, but as a patient, someone to be managed rather than trusted, and Edith felt the trap closing. She had fought for her mind, she had won her education, and now she was being punished for it in a way that was too subtle to fight back against. Because the punishment was not violence. It was concern. It was protection. It was Harold insisting, with the full support of the medical establishment, that everything he did was for her own good. There is no defense against someone who imprisons you while calling it love. Edith would spend the next decade trying to find one anyway. Chapter 5. When poetry became evidence of disease. Blanche Ulrichs published her first poem under a male pseudonym because even her husband believed women who wrote were damaged. She chose the name Michael Strange in 1919. Michael because it sounded strong, definitive, male. Strange because that was what she felt like. Strange, out of place in her own life. The poems she published were good. Critics praised their intensity, their emotional rawness, their refusal to be polite. Nobody knew Michael Strange was a woman. Nobody knew Michael Strange was married to John Barrymore. And for a brief moment, Blanche tasted the freedom of being taken seriously as an artist, rather than dismissed as a bored housewife with literary pretensions. Then Barrymore found the manuscripts. He was not supportive. He was enraged. Not because the poetry was bad, but because it existed at all. His wife was supposed to support his career, not build her own. She was supposed to be beautiful at parties and charming with his colleagues and available whenever he needed her to perform the role of devoted spouse. Writing poetry under a pseudonym suggested she had ambitions that competed with his. It suggested she believed her interior life was worth documenting. Worse, it suggested she was good at something other than being Mrs. John Barrymore. The fights escalated. Barrymore drank, which made him cruel. He told Blanche her poetry was mediocre. He told her she was embarrassing herself. He told her that women who tried to be artists were compensating for failures in their real purpose, which was motherhood and marriage. When Blanche defended her work, he called her hysterical. When she cried, he called her unstable. When she stopped arguing and went silent, he told their friends she was becoming dangerously withdrawn. The double bind was perfect. Speak, and you are shrill. Be silent, and you are depressed. There was no right answer, because the question itself was rigged. Blanche kept writing. She published more poems. She wrote a play. She started giving readings under her pseudonym, and audiences loved her. The work was being recognized. She was building something that belonged to her. But every success made the situation at home worse. Barrymore's jealousy curdled into something darker. He began monitoring her schedule, questioning where she went, who she talked to. He framed it as concern. She was working too hard. She was exhausting herself. She was becoming obsessed. Her family agreed. Blanche's mother arrived in New York to express worry about her daughter's mental state. All this writing, all this intensity, it wasn't healthy. Women needed balance. They needed to focus on their families. Blanche's insistence on pursuing a literary career was starting to look like mania. The medical term being whispered was the same one being used for Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Neurasthenia. Nervous exhaustion brought on by overexertion of the female mind. The diagnosis was always available for women who wanted too much, who felt too much, who refused to be satisfied with the roles assigned to them. In 1925, after a particularly brutal fight, Barrymore had Blanche evaluated by a psychiatrist. The doctor was a friend of the family. He understood what was expected. He met with Blanche for 40 minutes, asked her about her poetry, her marriage, her moods. Then he wrote a report concluding that she showed signs of emotional instability and manic tendencies. The evidence? She wrote prolifically. She spoke passionately about her work. She seemed more invested in her creative output than in her duties as a wife. The report was not a diagnosis. It was a threat. Barrymore used it to gain leverage. If Blanche did not stop publishing, if she did not stop embarrassing him with her public readings and her insistence on being taken seriously as an artist, he would have her committed. He had a doctor's statement. He had legal standing as her husband. The law in 1925 gave husbands nearly absolute power over wives deemed mentally unfit. All it took was one signature. Blanche faced the impossible choice: give up her art or lose her freedom entirely. For a while, she tried to negotiate. She would write less, publish under even deeper cover. But Barrymore's ego could not tolerate even the existence of her creativity. Every poem she wrote was an insult. Every success was a failure of her primary duty to make him feel important. By 1928, the marriage was over emotionally, but divorce was complicated. Barrymore controlled the money. He controlled access to their daughter. He controlled the narrative. If Blanche left, he would paint her as an unstable woman who abandoned her child for selfish artistic ambitions. He would use the psychiatric report. He would ruin her. So Blanche stayed, and the staying destroyed something inside her that would never fully recover. She kept writing in secret, kept publishing as Michael Strange. But the joy was gone. Every word she wrote felt like an act of defiance that would eventually be used against her. Every moment of creative flow was shadowed by the knowledge that her husband considered it evidence of disease. The tragedy was not that Blanche stopped writing. The tragedy was that she started to believe the diagnosis herself, that maybe her desire to create was pathological, that maybe the emptiness she felt in her marriage was her fault, that maybe she really was too intense, too demanding, too strange. The weapon had been planted. It would detonate later, but it was already ticking. Chapter 6. The night the Golden Girl went dark. By 1930, Zelda Fitzgerald had been called genius, muse, and madwoman, but never once had she been called free. The marriage started as a party and ended as a crime scene. For the first few years, Scott and Zelda were the golden couple of the jazz age. They danced on tables, they jumped into fountains, they drank bootleg liquor and spent money like it was confetti. Scott published The Great Gatsby in 1925, and it made him famous in a way that felt permanent. Zelda was his companion in chaos, his beautiful, wild wife who said outrageous things at parties and made everyone laugh. But underneath the performance, something was rotting. Scott was mining her. He took her words, her stories, her letters, and put them directly into his fiction. Whole passages from her diary appeared in his novels. He used her personality, her mannerisms, her soul as raw material for his characters. When Zelda noticed and objected, Scott told her she was being paranoid, that writers use their lives, that this was normal, but it was not normal. It was theft. And when Zelda decided she wanted to write her own novel, Scott forbade it. The fight happened in Paris in 1929. Zelda had been writing in secret, working on a manuscript about a young woman's marriage to a writer who consumed her identity. It was autobiographical, it was good, and Scott was furious. He told her that their life together was his material, not hers. That she had no right to tell the same stories he was telling because his career came first. He was the artist. She was the inspiration. That was the deal. Zelda had never agreed to that deal. But by 1930, she was starting to unravel. The drinking had gotten worse, and the parties felt desperate rather than fun. Scott's career was stalling, and he blamed her. He said her chaos distracted him, that her demands for attention drained his creative energy, that she was dragging him down. Zelda's mental health collapsed in April of 1930. She was hospitalized in Paris after a series of breakdowns that her doctors described as acute anxiety and possible schizophrenia. But the diagnosis was complicated by the fact that nobody asked what had caused the anxiety. Nobody investigated whether living with a man who stole your words and forbade your ambitions might produce symptoms that looked like mental illness. The treatment was rest, isolation, and the consistent message that Zelda needed to accept her role. She was not a writer. She was the wife of a writer. Her job was to support Scott's career. The doctors agreed with him completely. Women who competed with their husbands creatively were exhibiting pathological behavior. The cure was submission. Zelda was moved to a series of expensive sanatoriums, first in Switzerland, then America. The bills were enormous. Scott paid them and used the debt as leverage. He told her she owed him, that her illness was costing them everything, that if she would just accept her limitations and stop trying to be something she was not, they could be happy again. By 1932, Zelda managed to finish her novel anyway. Save Me the Waltz was published to mixed reviews and sold poorly. Scott was relieved. He had been terrified it would succeed, which would prove Zelda had talent independent of him. Her failure confirmed what he needed to believe, that she was his creation, his muse, his responsibility. The psychiatric establishment supported this narrative completely. Zelda's doctors at Phipps Clinic in Baltimore reviewed her novel and determined that the writing was evidence of her continued instability. She was too focused on herself, too unwilling to accept her subordinate position. The fact that she had written a book while hospitalized proved she was not taking her treatment seriously. The treatments intensified: isolation therapy, forced rest, medications that dulled her mind, and underneath it all, the consistent message: you are sick because you will not accept your place. The cure is obedience. Scott wrote essays about their marriage. He published them in magazines. He portrayed himself as the long-suffering husband of a mentally ill woman. He described her breakdowns in detail, using her pain as material for his essays the same way he had used her personality for his fiction. He turned her illness into another resource he could mine. And Zelda could not fight back, because fighting back was more evidence of illness. Anger was mania. Sadness was depression. Silence was catatonia. Every response was pathologized. Every emotion was a symptom. By 1936, she had been hospitalized multiple times. She had lost custody of their daughter. She had lost control of her own medical decisions. Scott worked with the doctors to determine her treatment. He decided when she could have visitors, when she could leave the hospital grounds, what she was allowed to write. The woman who had once jumped into fountains wearing an evening gown was now asking permission to hold a pen. The golden girl had gone dark, not because she was broken, but because breaking her had become necessary to maintain the story everyone needed to tell. The story where Scott Fitzgerald was the genius, and Zelda was the price he paid for his art. She would spend the rest of her life trying to escape that story, and she would fail. Chapter 7. What the Asylum Called Treatment. The cure for female madness in 1920 was obedience training dressed up as medical science and billed at $1,000 per month. The institutions were beautiful. That was part of the horror. Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, where Zelda Fitzgerald would eventually die, sat on a hill surrounded by gardens and mountain views. The buildings were elegant. The grounds were manicured. Promotional materials described it as a sanctuary for nervous exhaustion, a place where wealthy patients could recover in comfort and privacy. What they did not mention was the locked doors, the barred windows, the fact that comfort and imprisonment were not mutually exclusive. Edith Rockefeller McCormick never entered a traditional asylum. She did not need to. Her husband Harold transformed their estate, Riven Rock, into a private prison. He hired nurses. He consulted with psychiatrists. He created a therapeutic environment right inside their home. which meant Edith could be controlled without the scandal of public institutionalization. The treatment plan was simple: isolation from anyone who might encourage her intellectual ambitions. A strict routine designed to eliminate stress, which was medical code for eliminating autonomy. No visitors without Harold's approval. No correspondence he had not read first. No decisions about her own schedule or activities. Her $40 million trust was managed entirely by Harold and a board of male trustees. Edith received an allowance. She had to ask permission to make purchases above a certain threshold. The woman whose father had built Standard Oil was now requesting approval to buy books. The doctors Harold consulted agreed this was appropriate care. Women of Edith's class were fragile. Wealth made them more susceptible to nervous disorders. The best treatment was protective isolation combined with meaningful but non-taxing activities. Gardening, needlework, quiet reading of approved texts. What they meant was, keep her busy enough that she cannot think about the life she wanted, and quiet enough that nobody hears her scream. Blanche Elrics cycled through a series of private sanatoriums in the 1930s. Each one promised cutting-edge treatment for nervous disorders. Each one delivered the same program: rest cure, talk therapy designed to help you accept your circumstances rather than change them, and a consistent philosophical framework. Female mental health required accepting limitations. Women who wanted too much, who felt too much, who demanded too much, were fighting their own nature. The cure was surrender. Blanche's treatment included hydrotherapy, which meant being submerged in ice water or scalding water, depending on whether you were too manic or too depressed. It included isolation rooms where you were left alone for days with minimal food and no stimulation, supposedly to calm an overactive mind. And it included endless conversations with psychiatrists who asked over and over why she could not simply be satisfied as a wife and mother. The answer, which she eventually stopped giving, was that being satisfied required having a self, and herself had been so thoroughly colonized by the expectations of others that she no longer knew what satisfaction would feel like. Zelda's treatment at Highland Hospital was overseen by Dr. Robert Carroll, a pioneer in what he called aggressive physical therapy for mental illness. His methods included forced exercise regimens, strict dietary control, and insulin shock therapy. The insulin treatment involved injecting patients with enough insulin to send them into hypoglycemic shock. They would convulse, lose consciousness. Their brains would be deprived of glucose, which supposedly reset disordered thinking. What it actually did was cause terror and brain damage. Zelda underwent insulin shock treatment multiple times. She described it later as feeling like dying and being brought back against your will. The convulsions left her confused. The memory loss made it hard to write, which was perhaps the point. Creativity was evidence of mania. If the treatment dulled her creative drive, that meant it was working. Dr. Carroll charged $1,600 per month for Zelda's care. Scott paid it by writing short stories he hated, grinding out commercial fiction to finance the treatment that was breaking his wife's mind. He complained about the cost constantly. He told Zelda she was bankrupting them. He used the debt as proof that her illness was destroying their lives. But he never questioned whether the treatments were making her worse, because the medical establishment was unanimous. These treatments worked. Not because they cured mental illness, but because they produced compliant patients. Women who stopped fighting, who accepted their diagnoses, who became quiet and manageable and no longer embarrassing to their families. The success rate had nothing to do with mental health and everything to do with behavioral control. A woman was cured when she stopped asking for things her family did not want to give her, when she accepted her confinement as care, when she thanked her doctors for the privilege of being imprisoned. Edith Rockefeller McCormick spent 20 years in luxurious isolation at Riven Rock. She had servants. She had gardens. She had everything except freedom and dignity and the right to use her own mind. Blanche Ulrichs was in and out of institutions for a decade. Each stay broke her a little more. Each release came with conditions. Behave. Be grateful. Do not write anything that suggests you are unhappy. Zelda Fitzgerald would spend the better part of 18 years institutionalized, moving between hospitals, undergoing treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful, watching her daughter grow up through supervised visits, asking Scott for permission to do things she had once done without thinking. The institutions called it treatment. The families called it necessary. The women inside called it exactly what it was: a cage built from medical authority and family money. A place where inconvenient women were sent to be forgotten. And the truly horrifying part was how legal it all was, how accepted. How many people nodded along and agreed that yes, these women clearly needed help, and was it not generous of their families to provide such expensive care? Nobody asked what the women themselves wanted, because asking would have required believing they were capable of knowing, and that belief would have destroyed the entire system. Chapter 8. The Families Who Chose Silence Over Daughters. For the Rockefellers, McCormicks, and Fitzgeralds, a mad daughter was more useful than a rebellious one because madness could be hidden. Harold Fowler McCormick controlled every aspect of Edith's life for 23 years. He made medical decisions, financial decisions, social decisions. He decided which of her friends could visit, which family members could write to her, whether she could attend social functions, and he did it all with the full support of the law. The legal architecture of this control was elegant in its cruelty. Guardianship statutes in the 1920s gave husbands near total authority over wives deemed mentally incompetent. The threshold for incompetence was not high. A doctor's statement, evidence of erratic behavior, testimony from family members that the woman was not acting like herself. That was enough. Once guardianship was established, the husband controlled everything: the wife's property, her finances, her medical care. She could not sign contracts, could not make legal decisions, could not leave the house without permission. She became, legally, a child, and her husband became her keeper, Edith's fortune. The $40 million she had inherited from her father was placed in a trust controlled by Harold and a board of male trustees. She received an allowance. The trust paid for her care, which meant Harold determined how much money was spent keeping her imprisoned and called it medical necessity. The children were told their mother was too fragile for regular contact. Harold explained that visits upset her, that she became agitated and needed rest afterward. So the visits became rare, then supervised, then non-existent. Edith's children grew up seeing her as a patient rather than a person, someone damaged, someone who needed to be managed for her own protection. And Edith could not correct the narrative, because any attempt to assert her sanity, any insistence that she was being held against her will, was used as further evidence of her delusion. Paranoia was a symptom. Anger was a symptom. The trap was perfect. The Rockefeller family supported Harold completely. They could not afford a scandal. The family reputation was built on control, discipline, and the appearance of moral superiority. A daughter who had defied her husband and pursued intellectual ambitions threatened that image. But a daughter who was tragically ill could be explained, pitied, hidden away with sympathy rather than shame. So they chose the story that required her silence. Blanche Ulrichs lost custody of her daughter during one of her hospitalizations. Her family argued that she was unfit, that her mental instability made her dangerous to the child. The evidence was her commitment records, her diagnosis of manic depression, the fact that she had been hospitalized multiple times. The court agreed. Guardianship was granted to Blanche's mother, who promptly limited Blanche's access to her own child. Visits were supervised. Brief, contingent on Blanche remaining stable, which meant compliant. If she objected, if she fought the arrangement, it was used as proof that she was still too ill to be trusted. Blanche's trust fund, which should have given her financial independence, was controlled by male relatives who determined how much she could spend and on what. They paid for her hospitalizations. They paid for her living expenses when she was released, and they used that financial control to enforce behavioral control. Behave or we cut you off. Stay quiet or we send you back. The family narrative was consistent. Blanche was fragile, creative, troubled. She needed protection from herself. And was it not generous of the family to provide such expensive care, such patience, such unwavering support despite her difficulties? What they did not say was that the difficulties were largely created by the system designed to contain her. That the manic episodes often followed periods of forced isolation. That the depression deepened every time she was separated from her daughter or forbidden from writing. The illness and the imprisonment fed each other in a cycle that nobody wanted to interrupt, because interrupting it would require admitting that the treatment was the problem. Scott Fitzgerald rewrote Zelda's story in real time. He published essays about their marriage. He gave interviews. He crafted a narrative where he was the tortured genius married to a woman whose mental illness had destroyed their happiness. He described her breakdowns, her hospitalizations, her failed attempts at writing, and he did it with such convincing sadness that most readers believed him. The truth was more complicated. Scott had contributed to Zelda's breakdown by stealing her creative work, forbidding her autonomy, and then using her illness to justify his own failures. When his writing stalled, he blamed her chaos. When money got tight, he blamed her expensive treatments. When critics questioned his talent, he pointed to his difficult marriage as the reason he could not produce better work. Zelda became his excuse, his justification, his tragedy, and she could not defend herself because every defense was pathologized. If she said Scott had stolen her words, she was paranoid. If she said he had driven her to breakdown, she was deflecting responsibility. If she tried to publish her own account, he worked with her doctors to prevent it, arguing that writing was too stressful for her fragile mental state. Scott controlled her medical decisions through legal authority and financial leverage. He decided which hospitals, which doctors, which treatments. And the doctors deferred to him completely because husbands were assumed to know what was best for their wives. The medical bills gave him moral authority. He was sacrificing his career, his finances, his happiness to care for a mentally ill woman. How noble, how tragic, how unfair that genius should be shackled to madness. Nobody asked if the madness had been manufactured, if the treatments were making her worse, if the entire system was designed to produce exactly this outcome. A brilliant, difficult woman transformed into a manageable patient whose silence preserved everyone else's story. All three families made the same calculation. Keeping their daughters imprisoned was cheaper, legally simpler, and socially safer than allowing them freedom. Because freedom meant the possibility of truth, and truth would have destroyed the carefully constructed narratives that protected family names, fortunes, and reputations. So they chose the daughters who would disappear quietly over the daughters who might speak loudly. They chose control over love, silence over honesty, erasure over acknowledgement. And the law gave them every tool they needed to make that choice legally, medically, and morally defensible. The daughters had no appeal, no recourse, no path to freedom that did not require convincing the very people imprisoning them that they deserved release. It was a game designed so they could never win, and they lost. Chapter 9: The Final Breakings. There is a particular kind of death that happens when you are still breathing, but the world has decided you no longer exist. Edith Rockefeller McCormick spent her final years inside a mind that had learned to escape the only way available. If the external world was a prison, the internal world could become something else, somewhere else. She stopped fighting, stopped trying to convince anyone she was sane. Instead, she retreated into a reality that made more sense than the one imprisoning her. By 1930, after nearly 2 decades of isolation and control, Edith began displaying symptoms of genuine psychosis. She believed she was the reincarnation of Egyptian royalty. She spent money wildly, trying to recreate palaces she remembered from past lives. She made bizarre pronouncements. She alienated the few people still allowed to visit her. Harold and the doctors called this proof that her condition had always been serious, that their caution had been justified. They did not call it what it actually was: the predictable result of 20 years of psychological torture. If you lock someone in a cage long enough, eventually they forget what it feels like to stand upright. If you tell someone they are insane for long enough, eventually their mind finds refuge in the diagnosis. Edith died in 1932 of complications from surgery. She was 60. The obituaries were polite. They mentioned her father's fortune, her marriage, her philanthropic work in Chicago. They described her as eccentric, troubled, a woman who had struggled with her nerves. They did not mention that she had been one of the first trained psychoanalysts in the world, that she had studied with Carl Jung, that she had wanted to use her mind for something beyond decoration, that her husband had systematically destroyed her for daring to want more than the life assigned to her. Her fortune was distributed according to the trust terms Harold had controlled. Her children inherited wealth. The family name remained unblemished. And Edith's actual story, the one about a brilliant woman broken by the machinery designed to contain her, was buried with her. Blanche Ulrichs made one final attempt at freedom in 1937. She filed for divorce from her second marriage and tried to rebuild a life as Michael Strange. She wrote, she gave readings, she tried to be the artist she had always believed she could be, but the damage was permanent. The years of institutionalization had left her dependent on medication, fragile, unable to trust her own mind. She would start projects and abandon them, convinced they were worthless. She would have moments of clarity and brilliance, followed by crashes into depression so deep she could not leave bed for weeks. The cycles were not evidence of natural mental illness. They were the scars left by a system that had spent decades convincing her she was broken. When you are told you are sick often enough, by enough authority figures, eventually your body starts producing the symptoms to match the diagnosis. Blanche died in 1950 at age 60. The obituaries mentioned her marriages, her family name, Her poetry was noted as a minor footnote. Most of the coverage focused on her relationship with John Barrymore, as if her entire identity existed in proximity to his fame. The volumes of poetry she had published as Michael Strange were forgotten within a decade. Her plays were never revived. The artistic ambition that had made her family declare her mad disappeared from the historical record, leaving behind only the diagnosis. Zelda Fitzgerald died on March 10, 1948. She was 47 years old. She was still a patient at Highland Hospital, still undergoing treatment, still asking permission for things other people took for granted. That night, a fire broke out in the main building. The cause was electrical, probably faulty wiring in the old structure. The fire spread quickly. The building had locked doors, barred windows, safety features designed to keep patients from escaping. When the fire started, those features became death traps. Women screamed, banged on doors, tried to break windows. Staff evacuated some patients. Others were left behind in the chaos. Zelda was on an upper floor. She could not get out. 9 women died in that fire. Zelda's body was identified by a charred slipper. She was buried next to Scott, who had died 8 years earlier of a heart attack brought on by alcoholism. The obituaries called her Scott Fitzgerald's wife, his muse, the woman whose mental illness had complicated his genius. They mentioned her beauty, her wild youth, her tragic decline. They did not mention that she had written a novel, that she had been a talented painter, that she had wanted a life of her own and been systematically prevented from having one. Scott's biographers would later debate how much Zelda's illness had damaged his career. They analyzed his work for signs of the strain. They sympathized with the burden he had carried. A few noted that he had used her words in his fiction, but framed it as the natural appropriation of a writer mining his life for material. Almost nobody asked what Zelda's life might have been if she had been allowed to own her own story, if she had been permitted to write without her husband's permission, if her mental health had been treated as something to genuinely heal rather than something to control. The fire was ruled an accident. Highland Hospital continued operating. Doctor. A. Carroll's aggressive treatment methods were considered cutting edge for another decade before falling out of fashion. 3 women, 3 different paths, 3 identical endings. Edith broke under the weight of isolation until her mind created an escape her body could not follow. Blanche internalized the diagnosis until she could no longer distinguish between genuine illness and learned helplessness. Zelda died locked in a building designed to keep her safe, which turned out to mean keeping her contained until the containment killed her. The families mourned appropriately. They held funerals. They made statements. They moved on. And then they began the second erasure, the one that would ensure the real story never surfaced. Chapter 10. What the executors erased. After they died, the families moved quickly to ensure the true story would never surface in newspapers or history books. The first thing they destroyed was the correspondence. Letters between Edith and her friends, between Blanche and her fellow writers, between Zelda and the few people who had understood what was happening to her. These letters contained the unfiltered truth, complaints about their husbands, descriptions of their treatment, evidence that they understood exactly how they were being controlled and had fought against it. The McCormick family collected Edith's papers after her death. They claimed it was for archival purposes, to preserve the legacy of an important Chicago family. What they actually did was sort through everything, removing anything that contradicted the official narrative. Letters that showed Edith's intellectual vitality were kept. Letters that showed her anger at Harold were burned. The Rockefeller family cooperated fully. They had their own reputation to protect. The official biography of Edith Rockefeller McCormick, published in 1936, portrayed her as a tragic figure who had struggled with mental illness throughout her life. It mentioned her time in Switzerland as a symptom of her instability rather than a period of genuine intellectual achievement. Carl Jung was described as a questionable influence who had encouraged her delusions rather than as the psychoanalyst who had treated her as an equal. The biography sold well. It became the definitive account. And it was almost entirely fiction. Medical records were sealed. The laws around patient privacy meant that Edith's treatment records, her psychiatric evaluations, the reports Harold had used to justify her confinement, were all locked away. Researchers who later tried to access them were denied. The family cited medical ethics. They said it would be inappropriate to violate Edith's privacy. What they meant was, we cannot allow anyone to see the evidence of what we did. Blanche Elrich's literary executor was her family. They controlled which of her works remained in print. Her poetry collections, as Michael Strange, were allowed to go out of print quietly. Her plays were never published in complete editions. The manuscripts she had left behind were reviewed and deemed not suitable for publication. Too personal, too angry, too revealing of family secrets. Within 20 years of her death, Blanche had been reduced to a footnote in John Barrymore's biography, the woman who married the great profile, the troubled second wife who had complicated his life. Her artistic achievements were mentioned in passing, if at all. The fact that she had been institutionalized was used to explain away her creative work. She had written during manic episodes. The work was interesting as a symptom, not as art. Her daughter, who might have defended her mother's legacy, stayed silent. The daughter had grown up hearing that her mother was ill, unstable, difficult. She had internalized the family narrative. Speaking against it would have required rejecting everything she had been taught about the woman who gave birth to her. So, she said nothing. And Blanche disappeared. Scott Fitzgerald became Zelda's biographer by default. His essays about their marriage were collected and republished. His account of her mental illness became the authoritative version. When biographers wanted to write about Zelda, they started with Scott's descriptions. They interviewed people Scott had known, who repeated Scott's version of events. Zelda's own novel, Save Me the Waltz, went out of print. Her letters were controlled by the Fitzgerald estate, which meant they were controlled by people invested in preserving Scott's legacy. Letters that made Scott look bad were withheld from researchers. Letters that supported the narrative of Zelda as tragically mad were made available. The medical records from Highland Hospital were sealed. Dr. Carroll's treatment notes were classified as private medical documents. Researchers who wanted to understand what treatment Zelda had actually undergone, whether they had been appropriate, whether they had contributed to her decline, were blocked. The official story hardened into fact. Zelda Fitzgerald had been mentally ill. Her illness had been tragic but inevitable. Scott had done everything possible to help her. Her death in the hospital fire was a terrible accident. End of story. Nobody mentioned that Scott had used her words without permission, that he had forbidden her from pursuing her own writing career, that the doctors had treated her based on the assumption that wives should subordinate themselves to husbands, that the treatments had likely made her worse. Those details were inconvenient. They complicated the narrative. They made Scott look like something other than a tragic hero burdened by a mad wife. So they were erased. The legal mechanisms that had enabled the families to control these women while they were alive continued to protect the families after the women died. Estate laws, copyright laws, privacy laws, all of them could be weaponized to control the story, and the families used every tool available. They hired biographers who would tell the approved version. They donated papers to universities with restrictions on what could be published. They cooperated with researchers who accepted the official narrative and stonewalled those who questioned it. The result was a historical record that had been scrubbed clean. 3 women who had fought against their confinement, who had tried to claim their own minds and their own voices, were transformed into cautionary tales about female fragility. Their resistance was reframed as illness, their anger as symptom, their desire for autonomy as delusion. And because the families controlled the evidence, there was no way to prove otherwise. The truth was buried in sealed archives and destroyed letters and medical records that would never be released. What survived was the story the families wanted told, a story where they had been loving, patient, generous, where they had done everything possible to help daughters who were, tragically, beyond help. It was a lie, but it was a lie backed by money, legal authority, and institutional power. And for decades, it was the only story anyone knew. Chapter 11. The Daughters Who Remembered. A few witnesses refused to participate in the erasure, and their testimonies cracked the official story open decades later. The servants saw everything. They were invisible to the families, which meant they were present for moments that were supposed to remain private. They heard the fights. They saw the locked doors. They witnessed treatments that looked more like punishment than medicine. And some of them kept records. A nurse who worked at Highland Hospital in the 1940s wrote a diary that surfaced in the 1980s. She described the insulin shock treatments in detail, the way patients convulsed, the terror in their eyes, the way Dr. Carroll justified it as necessary medicine. She also described Zelda, articulate, insightful, desperate to be allowed to write. The nurse noted that Zelda seemed least stable after visits from Scott, when he would tell her she was bankrupting him and wasting her life. The diary was published in a small academic press. It did not make headlines, but it gave researchers evidence that contradicted the official story. Zelda had not been a hopeless case. She had been a woman trapped in a system designed to break her. A former servant of the McCormick household gave an interview to a historian in 1967. She was old by then, dying. She said she wanted the truth known before she went. She described Edith's isolation, the way Harold controlled every aspect of her life. She said Edith had been brilliant, funny, kind to the staff, and she said the family had treated her like a prisoner, not a patient. The historian published the interview in an academic journal. The McCormick family threatened legal action, and they claimed the servant was senile, unreliable, making up stories for attention. The journal issued a partial retraction, softening some of the claims. But the story was out there, and other researchers started looking for similar testimonies. Letters surfaced gradually. A cache of Blanche's correspondence was discovered in an attic in 1973. The letters had been kept by a friend who had ignored the family's request to destroy them. They showed Blanche's wit, her intelligence, her fury at being confined. They included descriptions of her treatments, her feelings about being separated from her daughter, her awareness that her family was using her diagnosis to control her. The letters were donated to a university archive. Scholars began writing articles that complicated the official biography. And Blanche was not just a troubled poet. She was a woman who had been systematically silenced for refusing to accept her assigned role. The feminist movement of the 1970s created space for these stories to be re-examined. Historians started asking new questions, not whether these women had been mentally ill, but whether the treatments had been appropriate, whether the diagnoses had been accurate, whether the entire system of asylum care for wealthy women had been about medicine or about control. Research into historical psychiatry revealed patterns. Women were institutionalized at far higher rates than men. The diagnoses women received often centered on behaviors like assertiveness, sexual desire, intellectual ambition, things that were considered normal in men but pathological in women. Treatments were designed to produce compliance, not wellness. The stories of Edith, Blanche, and Zelda fit perfectly into this pattern. They had been difficult, ambitious, unwilling to accept limitations, and they had been broken for it. Biographers began writing new accounts, books that centered the women's perspectives rather than their husbands or families. Books that examined the legal structures that had enabled their confinement. Books that asked what these women might have accomplished if they had been born into a world that valued their minds as much as their bloodlines. But the evidence was incomplete. So much had been destroyed. Medical records remained sealed. Key correspondence was missing. The people who had witnessed the worst of it were dead. What emerged was a partial truth, enough to know that the official story was wrong, enough to understand the mechanisms of control, but not enough to fully reconstruct what these women's lives had actually been like behind the locked doors and sealed archives. The gaps in the record were themselves evidence of what families were willing to destroy to protect their reputations, of how thoroughly wealth could purchase not just silence, but historical revision. Contemporary scholars acknowledge these limitations. They write carefully, noting what can be proven and what remains speculation. They use phrases like, "the available evidence suggests," and "we cannot know with certainty." They are being responsible historians. But the caution also obscures the truth, because sometimes the absence of evidence is evidence. When letters are systematically destroyed, that tells you something. When medical records are permanently sealed, that tells you something. When every official account tells the same sanitized story, that tells you someone worked very hard to make sure no other story could be told. The daughters who remembered, the witnesses who spoke, cracked the facade. They proved the official story was incomplete. They opened space for questioning, but they could not restore what had been taken, could not give back the years these women spent locked away, could not resurrect the books Blanche might have written, the patients Edith might have helped, the art Zelda might have created. The erasure was too thorough. The damage was permanent. What the witnesses preserved was proof that it happened, that these women had fought, that they had understood what was being done to them, that their silence was not acceptance but defeat, and sometimes proof of the crime is all that survives. Chapter 12. The weight of the name you inherit. To be born into Gilded Age royalty meant inheriting wealth, yes, but also inheriting the bars of a cage built long before you arrived. The story of these three women is not exceptional. That is the most devastating truth. For every Edith Rockefeller McCormick whose name we remember, there were dozens of daughters locked in attics whose names were deliberately forgotten. For every Zelda Fitzgerald whose story was eventually re-examined, there were hundreds of women who died in institutions without anyone questioning whether they had belonged there. The asylum population in America exploded between 1870 and 1950. By 1930, there were over 400,000 people institutionalized for mental illness in the United States. Women outnumbered men significantly. Wealthy women were institutionalized in private facilities that cost thousands of dollars per year. Poor women were sent to state asylums where they were warehoused in overcrowded wards. But the mechanism was the same: a husband's signature, a doctor's diagnosis, a legal system that treated women as property. The wealthy women had prettier cages, private rooms instead of dormitories, gardens instead of concrete yards, treatments that were called therapy instead of punishment. But the function was identical: to remove inconvenient women from public life and keep them removed until they either died or became compliant enough to return. The families who did this were not uniquely cruel. That is important to understand. They were products of a system that gave them absolute power over their female relatives and told them that using that power was loving protection. They genuinely believed that women who wanted education, who pursued creative work, who defied their husbands, were exhibiting signs of mental instability. The medical establishment supported this belief. Psychiatry in the late 19th and early 20th century was built on assumptions about female inferiority. Women's brains were smaller, doctors claimed, which meant they were less capable of complex thought. Women's reproductive systems made them prone to hysteria and nervous disorders. Women who tried to compete intellectually with men were damaging their health. These were not fringe theories. They were mainstream medical science, published in journals, taught in universities, used to justify laws that stripped women of rights. The laws themselves were the final piece of the machinery. Married women could not own property in their own names until the late 1800s. They could not vote until 1920. They could not serve on juries. They could not sign contracts without their husband's permission. And they could be committed to asylums based solely on a husband's request and a compliant doctor's signature. The system was designed to ensure that women who inherited wealth could not control it, that women who inherited genius could not use it, that women who inherited anything at all could not challenge the men who actually held the power. Edith, Blanche, and Zelda were trapped in this machinery. They fought against it in different ways. Edith pursued education. Blanche pursued art. Zelda pursued her own story. And all three were broken by the weight of a system that could not tolerate their resistance. Their families did what the system empowered them to do: diagnose the resistance as illness, institutionalize the illness, control the narrative afterward. The greatest luxury these families possessed was not their mansions or their millions. It was the power to decide whose sanity mattered, whose pain was real, whose story would be remembered. They used that power to erase their daughters, to transform complex women into cautionary tales, to rewrite history so that the women's confinement seemed tragic, but necessary rather than criminal. And they succeeded for decades. The official story stood. The women were remembered, if at all, as footnotes to male achievement or victims of their own fragile minds. It took generations of historians, archivists, and feminist scholars to crack those stories open, to find the evidence that had survived destruction, to ask the questions that challenged the official narrative. We know now that the madness was not in the women. It was in the system. That the real insanity was believing that female ambition was disease. that the true crime was using medical authority to imprison women whose only illness was wanting to be free. But we also know this: the power dynamics that enabled these erasures have not disappeared. They have evolved. Wealth still purchases the ability to control narratives. Families still use legal mechanisms to silence inconvenient relatives. Medical authority is still weaponized to dismiss women's testimony about their own experiences. The names change, the specific tools change, but the underlying question remains the same. Whose mind do we trust? Whose pain do we believe? Whose story matters enough to preserve? Edith Rockefeller McCormick wanted to use her brilliant mind to help others understand theirs. She was declared mad for it and spent 2 decades imprisoned in luxury. Blanche Ulrichs wanted to write poetry and claim her own voice. She was institutionalized for it and died believing she had always been broken. Zelda Fitzgerald wanted to tell her own story. She was forbidden from it, and when she finally tried anyway, the world dismissed her work as the ravings of an unstable mind. 3 women, 3 different dreams, 3 identical prisons. Their tragedy was not that they were born into wealth. It was that they were born into a world that demanded they trade their minds for their inheritances. That required their silence as payment for their survival. That built cages out of medical diagnoses and family concern and locked them inside until they either disappeared or died. The bars were made of silk and diamonds, but they were bars nonetheless. And the women who tried to break free were declared mad for refusing to accept that beauty as their destiny. We tell their stories now not because we can undo what was done to them. We cannot. But because remembering them is an act of restoration, an acknowledgement that they were not mad, they were crushed, and the machinery that crushed them was designed to do exactly that. The weight of the name you inherit can be wealth, and legacy, power, or it can be a cage built by people who loved you enough to want you perfect and feared you enough to destroy you when perfection revealed itself to be a performance you could not sustain forever. These women carried that weight until it killed them. The least we can do is remember that it was never theirs to carry in the first place.